What if the most powerful weapon in this war wasn't a missile, wasn't a stealth bomber, wasn't even a nuclear program? What if it was a tiny island, smaller than many American airports? An island that most people have never heard of, yet one that quietly keeps an entire nation's economy alive. Now imagine that the world's strongest military has already demonstrated it can strike that island whenever it wants. Its defenses, its radar, its missile sites, its naval facilities, all vulnerable, all within reach. But then something strange happens. The one target that could cause the greatest damage remains untouched. Not because it cannot be destroyed, because someone has chosen not to destroy it. At least, not yet. That creates a question far more interesting than whether another airstrike will happen. Why would a military deliberately spare the most valuable target in the entire war? Because the answer may reveal something far more important than the future of Iran. It may reveal how great powers now use economic pressure as a weapon, without ever pulling the final trigger. And, if that strategy succeeds, the future of warfare may depend less on destroying infrastructure, and more on controlling the fear that it could disappear tomorrow. For decades, military power was measured by destruction. The larger the explosion, the greater the victory appeared. Wars were judged by bridges collapsed, airfields cratered, factories destroyed, cities captured. Victory meant denying your enemy the ability to continue fighting. But modern conflict is beginning to rewrite that equation. Today, sometimes the most valuable target is the one you intentionally leave standing. Because an intact economic lifeline can become something even more powerful than rubble. It becomes leverage. That is the contradiction sitting at the center of this story. The objective is no longer simply to destroy. The objective is to control behavior. And those are two very different forms of power. Which brings us to one small island sitting quietly in the Persian Gulf. An island that, on paper, should have been one of the first places reduced to ruins. Instead, it has become one of the most carefully managed targets in the entire conflict. According to multiple public reports, U.S. forces have repeatedly struck military facilities associated with the island, while avoiding its core oil-export infrastructure. Iranian reporting has likewise maintained that oil loading operations largely continued after those attacks, although both sides naturally present events through their own narratives. That pattern is difficult to ignore, because it suggests something very deliberate. This isn't simply about damaging military capability. It's about shaping strategic choices. But here's the problem. To understand why this island matters, you first have to understand what it actually does. Because despite its tiny size, it may be one of the most economically important pieces of land anywhere on Earth. Its name is KHARG Island. From space, it doesn't look remarkable. A narrow strip of land sitting just off here and southern coastline. No massive cities. No towering mountains. No sprawling industrial complexes stretching across hundreds of miles. At first glance, it almost looks insignificant. But appearances can be dangerously misleading. Analysts have long described KHARG Island as the center of Iran's oil export system. For decades, pipelines carrying crude oil from some of Iran's largest producing fields have converged here. Specialized loading terminals allow enormous oil tankers to dock offshore. Storage facilities prepare millions of barrels for shipment. And from this small island, energy flows outward to customers around the world. That means KHARG is far more than a port. It is the connection between Iran's energy reserves and the global economy. Without that connection, oil still exists underground, but selling it becomes dramatically more difficult. That distinction matters, because countries do not finance governments with oil beneath the ground. They finance governments by moving that oil onto ships, which means transportation infrastructure can become just as strategically important as the oil fields themselves. Military planners have understood this reality for decades. Long before today's tensions, long before drones dominated headlines, long before artificial intelligence entered military planning, strategists already recognized that KHARG represented one of Iran's most valuable strategic assets. The island has remained important through revolutions, regional wars, sanctions, economic crises, and changing governments. Its importance has survived all of them. That kind of consistency is rare, because most military targets lose relevance as technology evolves. KHARG never really did. If anything, its importance has grown, and that raises an uncomfortable question. If everyone understands how valuable this island is, why hasn't anyone simply destroyed it? That question leads directly into the next chapter of the story. Because before bombs began falling, one idea had already existed in American strategic thinking for decades. An idea that would eventually shape everything that followed. For decades, military planners have understood one uncomfortable truth. Destroying an enemy's military is difficult. Destroying its economy is often much easier. And, on KHARG Island, those two targets sit almost side by side. That is what makes this place so unusual. The island is heavily defended. Military radar, air defense batteries, naval facilities, missile storage sites. But only a short distance away and the loading terminals that connect Iran's oil fields to the rest of the world. The world's energy markets don't care about missile batteries. They care about oil. And that's exactly why the distinction matters. According to multiple available reports, when U.S. strikes first targeted KHARG Island earlier this year, military facilities absorbed the damage. But the oil export infrastructure remained largely intact. That wasn't an accident. It appears to have been a deliberate choice. And that decision raises a much bigger strategic question. If America could hit the island, why didn't it hit the one target that actually mattered most? Because destroying military capability and destroying economic leverage are two very different strategies. One wins battles. The other changes political behavior. And sometimes preserving the threat is more valuable than using it. That may sound counterintuitive, but military coercion has always depended on credible restraint. Once the ultimate weapon is used, its psychological value disappears forever. Which means the real power may not be in destroying the terminal. The real power may be convincing everyone that it could be destroyed tomorrow. That changes every calculation inside Tehran, every insurance premium in London, every oil futures contract in New York, every shipping decision crossing the Persian Gulf. The weapon doesn't have to fire. Sometimes it only has to remain loaded. But here's where the story becomes even more complicated. Because Iran wasn't simply watching these strikes happen, it was adapting. Additional defensive systems reportedly appeared around the island. Military personnel increased. Coastal surveillance expanded. Analysts believe Iranian planners understood exactly what KHARG represented. If the island became vulnerable, the entire country's economic survival could become vulnerable as well. And that created an entirely new kind of battlefield. Not one centered on bombs, but one centered on uncertainty. Could America actually destroy the terminal? Would it? Or was the threat itself the strategy? Those questions mattered just as much as the explosions themselves. Because markets react to possibilities long before they react to confirmed destruction. Insurance companies do the same. Shipping companies do the same. Governments certainly do. Which leads to an even deeper realization. Perhaps the objective was never to erase KHARG Island. Perhaps the objective was to make every captain sailing toward it wonder whether today's voyage might become the last. And that brings us to the next evolution of the campaign. Because instead of targeting the island itself, the battlefield began moving out onto the water. But here's the problem. Bombing an oil terminal is dramatic. Stopping oil from ever reaching that terminal can be even more effective. And according to available reporting, that is exactly where the strategy began to shift. Instead of escalating directly against KHARG Island's export facilities, the United States increasingly focused on the sea around it. At first glance, that might seem like a smaller move. In reality, it may represent the larger strategic evolution, because KHARG Island is only valuable if ships can reach it. Oil sitting inside storage tanks has no economic value. It only becomes power when it leaves the island. That means every tanker approaching KHARG becomes part of the battlefield. Not because it is a military target, but because it is part of the supply chain. And modern warfare increasingly targets systems instead of individual objects. Reports indicate that U.S. forces intensified enforcement around maritime traffic headed toward Iranian ports. In one widely reported incident, a commercial tanker allegedly attempting to approach KHARG was disabled before reaching its destination. According to official statements, precision fire targeted the vessel's propulsion system rather than sinking the ship itself. That detail matters, because it reflects a completely different philosophy of escalation. The objective was not maximum destruction, it was maximum interruption. Disable movement, preserve leverage, avoid unnecessary casualties, and most importantly, Keep the economic pressure growing without triggering the international shockwave that would likely follow the destruction of one of the world's most important oil export terminals. That created a fascinating strategic paradox. The island remained operational. The loading facilities still existed. The pipelines still connected the mainland. But every voyage toward KHARG suddenly carried a new level of uncertainty. Could the tanker arrive? Would insurance still cover the trip? Would another blockade order be announced tomorrow? Would naval escorts become necessary? Every unanswered question increased the cost of doing business. And that's how economic warfare often works. Not through spectacular explosions, but through rising uncertainty. Energy markets understand uncertainty better than almost anyone. They price risk instantly. Every report of renewed fighting, every warning to commercial shipping, every announcement involving the Strait of Hormuz can move billions of dollars within hours. Oil traders are not waiting for infrastructure to be destroyed. They are pricing the possibility that it might be. That's why the global energy market often reacts long before the battlefield reaches its final outcome. But the economic effects don't stop with oil companies. Higher crude prices eventually affect airlines, shipping costs, manufacturing, food transportation, consumer prices. A narrow island in the Persian Gulf can influence inflation thousands of miles away. That is the extraordinary power of strategic geography. Which leads to another question. If controlling KHARG is this important, why doesn't someone simply seize it? On paper, the idea sounds straightforward. Remove the defenses, land forces on the island, control the export terminal, and Iran's primary source of oil revenue. Some political voices have openly suggested exactly that. But military planners understand that capturing territory is fundamentally different from striking it. An air campaign can last hours. An occupation can last months or years. Holding KHARG would require protecting it every hour of every day. Against missiles, against drones, against naval attacks, against sabotage, against special operations, against a determined defender fighting only a few miles from its own coastline. The operation would not end when troops landed. It would begin, and that's why many analysts believe the threat of seizure may provide more leverage than an actual occupation. Because once forces commit, the strategic risks multiply rapidly, which raises the biggest question yet. If neither side wants to destroy the island, and neither side truly wants to occupy it, then what exactly are they fighting over? The answer may have less to do with territory, and far more to do with control of the world's most important energy lifeline. But here's the deeper problem. KHARG Island was never the ultimate objective. It was only one piece of a much larger machine. The real battlefield has always been the water surrounding it. Because every barrel of oil leaving KHARG must pass through one unavoidable gateway, the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow stretch of water is one of the greatest strategic bottlenecks ever created by geography. At its narrowest point, it is only a few dozen miles across. Yet according to widely cited energy estimates, roughly 1/5 of the world's seaborne oil trade moves through this corridor. That means an interruption here is never just Iran's problem. It becomes everyone's problem. A disruption in the Gulf can affect fuel prices in Europe, manufacturing costs in Asia, transportation networks in North America. The consequences travel much farther than the missiles themselves. And that changes how militaries think. Because once a conflict reaches Hormuz, it is no longer simply about defeating an opponent. It becomes about controlling access. History has demonstrated this before. During the Iran-Iraq tanker war in the 1980s, commercial shipping became part of the conflict. Oil tankers were attacked. Naval escorts became necessary. Insurance premiums skyrocketed. International navies expanded their presence. The lesson from that period was simple. When shipping is threatened, global powers eventually become involved. Not because they seek war, but because they cannot afford to lose the flow of energy. That historical experience still shapes military planning today, which explains why recent operations have repeatedly focused on coastal radar sites, missile positions, drone launch areas, naval facilities. At first, those targets may seem unrelated to commercial shipping. In reality, they are directly connected. Before a missile can threaten at anchor, someone has to detect the tanker. Before drones can intercept a vessel, someone has to track its movement. Before fast attack boats can swarm commercial traffic, someone has to coordinate them. Modern maritime warfare begins with information. Destroy the sensors, and you weaken the weapons that depend on them. Military planners often describe this as attacking the enemy's kill chain, not simply eliminating launchers, but breaking the entire sequence that allows an attack to happen in the first place. Find, track, identify, target, strike, interrupt any one of those steps, and the entire system becomes less effective. That helps explain why surveillance infrastructure has become such a frequent target. The objective isn't necessarily to destroy every missile. It's to make those missiles blind. But Iran has adapted as well. Analysts believe Tehran understands that if it cannot always match American air power directly, it can still create strategic pressure through uncertainty. Fast attack craft, naval mines, anti-mine ship missiles, long-range drones. None of these systems needs to defeat an entire navy. They only need to convince commercial shipping that the risk is becoming unacceptable. And once shipping companies begin rerouting vessels, or insurers dramatically increase premiums, the economic effects begin long before a single tanker is actually sunk. That is the remarkable reality of modern deterrence. Sometimes perception produces consequences faster than destruction itself. Which brings us back to KHARG Island. Its true value was never the concrete on the shoreline. Its value was always its connection to global commerce. The pipelines, the tankers, the shipping lanes, the insurance markets, the energy exchanges. Take away any one of those links, and the entire system starts losing efficiency. Take away several, and an economy begins to feel the pressure, which leads to the biggest strategic reversal in this entire story. Perhaps this campaign was never designed to destroy Iran's oil industry overnight. Perhaps it was designed to gradually reduce its ability to function at full capacity. Because in modern warfare, destroying infrastructure is often the least sophisticated option. Controlling the system that infrastructure depends on can be far more powerful. And that realization changes everything. Because it suggests this conflict isn't really about one island. It's about who controls the flow of energy in the 21st century. And that question extends far beyond the Persian Gulf. That brings us to the question almost nobody was asking. What if KHARG Island isn't the target, but the warning? Because once you step back from the daily headlines, a different pattern begins to emerge. This isn't simply a campaign against military bases. It isn't simply a campaign against oil exports. It is a campaign against confidence. Confidence that tankers can sail safely. Confidence that energy markets will remain stable. Confidence that global supply chains will continue operating without interruption. And once confidence begins to disappear, markets react faster than armies. That's why analysts often describe energy as the world's most sensitive strategic commodity. Oil doesn't have to stop flowing for prices to rise. People only have to believe that it might. Every missile launch, every intercepted drone, every warning issued to commercial shipping, every report of another blockade, each one increases uncertainty. And uncertainty has become one of the most powerful weapons in modern conflict. But here's the deeper transformation. For decades, military power was measured by destruction. How many aircraft could you deploy? How many tanks could you destroy? How much territory could you capture? Today, those questions are no longer enough. Modern strategy increasingly asks a different question. How much economic disruption can you create without triggering a full-scale war? That is a far more difficult balance. Destroy too little, and your opponent ignores you. Destroy too much, and the international response may unite against you. The most effective pressure often exists somewhere in between. Enough to create uncertainty, not enough to create uncontrollable escalation. KHARG Island sits precisely at that intersection. It is valuable enough to threaten, dangerous enough to avoid, visible enough for the entire world to watch, and economically important enough that every military decision made their echoes through financial markets almost immediately. That is why every operation around the island carries consequences far beyond the battlefield. An insurance company in London may change its rates. A refinery in South Korea may reconsider future deliveries. An airline in Europe may calculate higher fuel costs. A manufacturer in the United States may suddenly face more expensive transportation. None of those companies are participating in the conflict, yet all of them feel its effects. That is the extraordinary reach of economic warfare. The battlefield is no longer confined to where missiles land. It extends into ports, banks, commodity exchanges, shipping companies, investment funds, supply chains, even the grocery stores where ordinary families eventually pay higher prices. The front line has become global. And perhaps that is the most important lesson KHARG Island offers. The strongest military does not always need to destroy an economy. Sometimes it only needs to convince the world that the economy has become unpredictable. Because once businesses begin changing their behavior voluntarily, the strategic objective may already be taking shape. Which raises one final question. If uncertainty itself has become a weapon, what happens when every major power begins using the same strategy? In the end, this story was never really about a 5-mile island. It was about a new model of warfare. For generations, military victories were measured by cities captured, factories destroyed, armies defeated. Today, those traditional measures still matter, but they are no longer the whole picture. The conflicts shaping the 21st century are increasingly fought inside systems. Energy systems, financial systems, shipping systems, information systems. The objective is no longer simply to destroy an opponent. It is to make the opponent's entire network less reliable. KHARG Island illustrates that transformation almost perfectly. According to available reporting, the military facilities around the island have repeatedly come under attack. Yet the oil export infrastructure itself has largely remained intact. That contrast may be the most revealing fact of the entire conflict, because it suggests the objective was not immediate destruction. It was sustained pressure. Every strike demonstrated capability. Every warning reinforced uncertainty. Every intercepted shipment reminded the world that access to energy could no longer be taken for granted. That creates leverage without necessarily crossing the threshold into total economic devastation. Whether that strategy succeeds is still an open question. History shows that coercion can influence political decisions. It also shows that nations under sustained pressure often adapt in unexpected ways. Iran may expand alternative export routes. Regional powers may strengthen maritime security cooperation. Global energy companies may diversify supply chains to reduce dependence on any single choke point. Each move creates a counter-move. Each adaptation forces another adaptation. That is the endless cycle of strategic competition. And perhaps that is the biggest lesson here. Technology has not eliminated geography. It has made geography even more valuable. A single island, a narrow waterway, a handful of shipping lanes. These seemingly small locations now influence decisions made in capitals thousands of miles away. Because the world has built an economy that depends on uninterrupted movement. When movement becomes uncertain, everything else becomes uncertain too. This is not only about Iran. It is not only about the United States. It is not only about KHARG Island. This is about whether future wars will be won by destroying military forces, or by quietly controlling the economic systems those forces exist to protect. That may become one of the defining strategic questions of our century. And the answer is still being written. So here's the question worth leaving you with. If you were a military planner, would you choose to destroy your opponent's most valuable asset? Or would you keep it standing, using the constant threat against it as a weapon for as long as possible? Because that choice may tell us far more about the future of warfare than any missile strike ever could. There is one final irony in this entire story. The most powerful weapon in this conflict may never have exploded. It may have been uncertainty itself. Think about what we've seen. Military facilities were struck. Naval assets were targeted. Shipping routes came under increasing pressure. Commercial vessels faced growing risks. Energy markets reacted. Insurance costs climbed. Governments rushed into emergency consultations. Yet the single piece of infrastructure that could have caused the greatest economic shock, the oil terminal itself, largely remained standing. According to available reporting, that should tell us something. Modern military power is no longer measured only by what you destroy. It is increasingly measured by what you can hold at risk. The ability to threaten has become almost as valuable as the ability to attack. Because once your opponent believes you have both the capability and the willingness to act, their decisions begin changing before the strike ever happens. That is the essence of strategic deterrence. And KHARG Island may become one of the clearest modern examples of it. For decades, military planners focused on firepower. Today, they are just as focused on leverage. Firepower destroys options. Leverage preserves them. A destroyed oil terminal cannot be threatened again. A functioning oil terminal can influence political calculations every single day. That is an entirely different form of warfare. One built on pressure instead of annihilation. One built on uncertainty instead of occupation. One built on controlling choices instead of controlling territory. And that may be where future conflicts are headed. Artificial intelligence. Long-range drones. Autonomous naval systems. Space-based surveillance. Precision missiles. All of these technologies are making it easier to influence global systems without launching full-scale invasions. The battlefield is becoming less about borders and more about networks. Who controls information? Who controls logistics? Who controls energy? Who controls confidence? Because confidence may ultimately become the most valuable strategic resource of all. The moment markets lose confidence, supply chains begin to fracture. Investments slow. Shipping reroutes. Prices rise. Governments react. The battlefield expands far beyond the military itself. Whether this strategy ultimately succeeds in the Persian Gulf remains uncertain. Diplomatic efforts continue. Regional actors are still attempting to reduce tensions. Military planners on every side continue adapting to new realities. As with any rapidly evolving conflict, today's battlefield may look very different tomorrow. But one lesson already appears difficult to ignore. KHARG Island has become far more than an island. It has become a symbol of how geography, economics, technology, and military strategy are becoming impossible to separate. The next generation of wars may not begin with the destruction of infrastructure. They may begin with the threat hanging over it. And that distinction could reshape how nations compete for decades to come. So let me leave you with one final strategic question. If the most effective weapon is no longer the one that destroys the target, but the one that convinces the world the target could disappear at any moment, have we entered an era where uncertainty has become the most powerful weapon on Earth?